I was part of a small team, a small working group of academics from across the UK who came together during COVID as a response to all the challenges that we've had to try and work together to find out what was happening in other departments across the UK. I'm not a head of department myself, but it was the conference or the council of heads of department that came together, and we wrote some fieldwork principles. And so I've been invited to speak about the principles for undergraduate fieldwork, and I want to question, can they guide us in creating sustainable fieldwork learning opportunities? So I have, let me try this. Here we go. I have an outline, and I'll keep referring to this outline. You'll see this slide over and over again as we progress through the material. So I'll talk about the 5 principles for undergraduate fieldwork. I'll focus in on principle 2, which is called sustainable fieldwork, which obviously relates to the theme today. I'll ask the thorny question of how do we reduce the fieldwork emissions footprint without reducing the quality of the learning experience. And then I'll try and broaden our thinking beyond just carbon calculating, which is really the focus of principle 2, to think about sustainability more broadly and its kind of underpinning ideas around futurity, equity, and environment. And I will ask you to take a quiet moment to consider, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sustainable is your fieldwork? And then together we'll share our ideas for making our fieldwork more sustainable in the future. And I'll end, if I may, and if there's time, with my kind of own ideas for a field-based pedagogy for sustainability in higher education. So how did this all begin? During 2020 and kind of lockdown situations, the Conference of Heads of the UK Higher Education Institutions, that's the CHGHEI, which just trips off the tongue, noticed intersecting issues relating to taught undergraduate field courses as part of sharing our response to COVID. So what suddenly in this new environment, what were we going to do? And we really talked about, initially, the conversation was about the arms race of exotic field trips. This idea that to be a successful course, obviously I'm in geography and I recognise some people are in environmental science, archaeology, geology, etc. departments, but in geography, selling the course was partly done through selling an exotic or far-flung field trip. And there was a kind of arms race, you know, our course goes to New Zealand, so perhaps you'd like to come to us rather than a competitor's course. So in response to that and with COVID, we really focused in on ideas of sustainability and carbon footprints of travel, on accessibility to fieldwork, on inclusivity and equality of opportunity, and also on fieldwork and mental health. So those are the ideas that are encapsulated in the 5 principles. So you may ask, what are the 5 principles? Well, I'll go through each one in turn, but I will return to principle 2 in more detail. So the first principle is learning in the field, i.e. a commitment to an extended in-depth engagement in the field so that students experience a diversity of spaces and places. It's recognised this is an important mode of learning. I know that in the field, in some parts of the disciplines might mean in the archive, in some parts of the disciplines it might mean in a virtual environment, but generally it also can mean outdoors, it can mean far-flung environments. And so there are benefits of this kind of work. And so yeah, that is the first principle, the importance of learning in the field for a geographical and environmental education being absolutely integral. The second principle is sustainable fieldwork, and we will come back to it, but basically fieldwork often involves travel, and that gives us a choice of destinations. Those choices should therefore be justified by the learning outcomes associated with them. So it's really important to justify why you need to travel and the carbon footprint that you engender in the process of doing fieldwork. The third principle is around safe, responsible and ethical fieldwork. The University Safety and Health Association, the USHA, ensures that we need to sign up to good practice in terms of health and safety, risk assessments, ethical review. But sometimes we don't consider in those things like the ethics around the visited communities that we work with, the other stakeholders who might be involved, some aspects of staff experience as well as just student experience. So there are codes of conduct around that need to be in place when we undertake field work. The fourth principle is about accessible and inclusive field work. So ensuring that all students have the opportunity to engage in environments that are unfamiliar to them, as well as more local contexts. So the well-being of students and staff, including their mental and physical health, as well as all of the protected characteristics, needs to be considered here. So in addition to our ethical review and our risk assessments, an equality impact assessment is something that departments can consider here as a kind of risk assessment plus, to really think this should be undertaken for all fieldwork that we provide. So this audit and research approach to the fieldwork that we're offering, thinking about people's ability to participate, not just the cost of fieldwork, but also whether people have caring responsibilities. So thinking through all the different protected characteristics of our students and staff of their ability to participate in the field. And then the final principle is around staff in the field. We really focus often on students in terms of fieldwork and the student experience, but what about staff? This is about recognising that staff take on significant responsibilities when they deliver to undergraduate fieldwork, and we really need to consider staff as well as students. So it's around appropriate resourcing, it's around staff training and support so that they can deliver high quality field learning that's safe for everybody. But it's also about rewarding workload schemes. Some people might see fieldwork as, you know, this happy, jolly time where you're jetting off and not recognise, you know, this is a 24/7 kind of activity. And some staff have different capabilities to actually take part in that and to be away from home if that's needed, and different capacities to be able to lead on fieldwork too. So those are the principles. And departments were asked to sign up to the principles. And the idea of the principles is not a per field trip sign up, it's as a programme. So whatever programme you're delivering, we're thinking about the programme learning outcomes for this. So it's a programme level commitment. 29 departments have signed up. There are more than 29 departments across the UK. And so, yeah, we want to think about what might be barriers to signing up to this, what might help people sign up to it, which bit is really scary. And actually, I think the sustainability principle around the carbon auditing is a big piece of work to do there. And maybe until people have had a go at this, they won't feel ready to sign up. So we'll see. But for each of the principles, the Royal Geographical Society has hosted a website for this, and there's a huge amount of resources. There's reading materials, there's different web links to all of this material, and it's quite international. It's not just UK focused. There are also resources across different disciplines. So it's really worth having a look for each of those. See how I'm doing for time. Perfect. Okay, so we're going to go back to Principle 2 and let's just look at what this really means. So Principle 2, if you remember, was sustainable fieldwork. And I've got this picture just to try to show the balancing act between environmental costs and educational benefits. So the environmental impact and carbon footprint needs to be justified in the context of the learning outcomes. That was our principle. In other words, could you achieve the same learning with a lower carbon footprint? Now that hinges on being able to measure lots of different things. How do you measure carbon? Okay, we've got carbon calculators and there are lots recommended on the website, but how do you measure student well-being, staff well-being, all the things we've talked about in the other principles? How do you measure the students' learning? These are a bit more tricky to do. Actually, some really interesting research done by the Greenlight Trust. This is a charity in Suffolk that exposes people to outdoor learning. And they've shown that it actually reduces hospital visits, it reduces doctors' visits, and they've costed it in those terms. So it's a way of how do we actually account for this? So that's above and beyond the actual just learning, it's a well-being measure. So that might be something we want to think about. But the actual commitments that departments are signing up to, so if you haven't already signed up as your own department, just to give you a flavour, under Principle 2, is the first one is that programmes undertake a carbon audit of all travel associated with taught undergraduate fieldwork. So that's the whole programme, not just a single trip. That programmes should offer low carbon field trip options. And obviously that then raises issues of trip choice, different costs, different levels of carbon. The third one is evaluation and mitigation of environmental impact should involve the input of students. So in other words, having these critical conversations with students so that they can see the different arguments and that there are trade-offs to be had. So raising these issues with students and also publishing to students the outcomes of those discussions. And then finally, that programmes should review the carbon footprint of their field education annually with the aim of reducing it over time. So as I say, there is a burden to signing up to this. It's quite a lot of work to get your head around this if this is something that your department has never done before for the whole programme. Okay, so how do we reduce fieldwork emissions without reducing the quality of the learning experience? Now, I could have tackled this in a lot of different ways. What I've chosen to do is to take 3 examples of the resources from the Royal Geographical Society site that's collated lots of materials. So you can see the kind of level of resources and the types of issues that arise from it. And I'm going to go through each of those in turn as if they're kind of options, I suppose. We'll see. So these are all resources sitting under Principle 2. But as I go through them, I'd like you to listen to them with respect to a broad conception of sustainability under the headings of kind of environment, futurity and equity, and to think of sustainability in the round, not just as carbon. Okay, so here we go. Don't go there. Option 1, just don't go there. Okay, so Anna, now I don't know how to pronounce her surname perfectly, so apologies if this isn't quite right, but Guausko has written an article in the Geographical Journal. It's a theoretical piece, but based on her own experience of doing her PhD without doing field work and constantly having to justify why she didn't travel as part of that. So she describes this as an ethic of not going there, which means that fieldwork and travel should never be the presumed norm, and that doing fieldwork must be justified in the same way that not doing fieldwork should be justified. So not, and also she uses the notion of access, not assuming that every place is always accessible to you and should be just open to you to access. So obviously there's a whole bundle of colonial, exploitative, potentially entitlements to other people's stories, other people's knowledge, that for you is your field trip, which is built into that negative conception of access. And then there's a positive conception of access where she says access is love. So there's access is violence versus access is love. Access is love is about care, trust, respect, and reciprocity. So she advocates for a place-based research that builds on deep ties, commitments, and accountability, rather than the type of field trip that parachutes in, collects data, and takes it away. So it's about this long-term commitment. So remember, I'm asking you about environment, futurity, equity. Keep thinking in those terms. The reference is down there. So that's one option, don't travel. But still do field work, right? Still do field work, but don't travel to do it. The second, I'm presenting these as options, but I'm making that up. These are not presented as options. I'm just trying to give you, these are just different resources that are available to enhance your thinking about this area. But another resource is a paper by Grinstead and Nielsen from Roskilde University in Denmark, where their students were very prepared to go on an exotic foreign field trip, or even to Copenhagen, but actually ended up going to a local nature park. And at the end of the experience, we're really glad that they had done that, because although this was a research methods module that was being taught, what actually happened was a really authentic in the field methodological training about sustainability challenges, because all the local participants in the research, the local authority, the mayor's office, the municipality's planning division, the city's community building association, etc., all together created a situation where what mattered to them were the sustainable development goals. And so it became about sustainability. And the community, this collaboration actually generated the assessment. So it was very authentic. Students were presenting back, so it could really make a difference during the research. So the pedagogic approach was that fieldwork provides a direct experience of sustainability challenges and offers methodological training to address it in context. So I just thought this was a superb example of doing fieldwork, but very much keeping it local. So in carbon terms, very, very low. Okay. A slightly different option, and something that really, if you're signing up to the fieldwork principles, you're being asked to do, is the carbon audit. And two colleagues from Durham University have done a large-scale departmental audit. So the reference again is at the bottom, Williams and Love. And so they've looked at Durham University. It's a massive provider of undergraduate fieldwork. We would just love some of their students at Oxford Brookes University. I'm sure many other departments would feel the same. But we can actually quantify that 502 tons of CO2 equivalent per annum is used in their field trips. And you can see the 9 field trips on the graph. The one with the red arrow is the compulsory field trip. So there is optionality. So you could choose a lower carbon option. And that Portugal trip has actually per person a relatively low carbon footprint. But the reason that this department has done this audit is that aviation for research and teaching was by far the single biggest source of carbon and the easiest to change. This was regarded as low-hanging fruit in terms of trying to address sustainability at the departmental level. So the graph is showing aviation emissions, and the costings in there are the offset costs. I hadn't appreciated the screen would be quite so tiny. Yeah, a bit more detail though. The beauty of their research is that they've zoomed in on understanding the students' voice on this. So what do students think about different options? What do they think is part of addressing climate change challenges? And what would they find acceptable? So students, according to this graph, are keen to learn about climate change and sustainability, and they're very keen for campus-wide initiatives. So things like green energy on campus and divesting from fossil fuels. Much less supportive when it comes to reducing aviation travel for themselves. Staff a little bit more supportive if it's staff research, but for themselves, not so much. Okay, if we dig a bit deeper, has that changed? Sorry, I think my slide is stuck. Thank you. Is students' views on reducing the field trip emissions. So assuming you're going on the field trip, how might you reduce the field trip emissions? So they favour offsetting or overland travel rather than discontinuing with the far-flung travel. Now, if you remember, when I started, I said that the reason that the committee of heads got together in the first place was to try and reduce this arms race of exotic field trips. We have a job to do to convince our students that this is what we should be doing. And so I think it's important to understand the student view because it provides an additional barrier or challenge to us in doing this. We don't want to fall back to the arms race. So, not sure why. Which arrow, sorry? That one. That's okay. Thank you. So, I asked you when I introduced those 3 different resources from Principle 2 on the RGS website to think about equity, futurity and environment. I don't know if people have got comments and want to put ideas in the chat around those different options, but really what I want to say in response to those 3 exemplars is that pedagogy is absolutely vital. The way we design our field work is so important. It's not just about going on a trip, it's really thinking about what is the learning. Do we need to travel to access that learning? And in some cases, yes, we might need to travel, but be really clear about what it is about that that's necessary. And are there other things that up front we can develop in students' minds and skills that we can develop so that if we do then travel, we're maximising every drop of time in the field that's got a field work, that's got a carbon cost. So thinking about equity, you know, this idea of access that's been introduced, the long-term relationships that we can develop through fieldwork. I think these are just as important for thinking about sustainability as carbon. I don't think we can just detach and think only about this issue as a carbon issue. We need to think about the relationships we have with the people whose home is our field and really think that through. Because sustaining those relationships is vital too. And I know that during COVID, people who had really good long-term research relationships and teaching relationships with colleagues overseas could quickly flip and use that relationship to provide online experiences for students without needing to travel, because that relationship was strong, reciprocal, and already existed. Has that moved on? Yep. Did it? Sorry. Okay, so quiet reflection just for a minute. How sustainable is your fieldwork? And I'm talking about this in the round: environment, futurity, equity. How sustainable is your fieldwork? Just reflect on your own fieldwork in the terms that I've introduced for 30 seconds. And then I'm going to ask you to use the chat, and I've got someone who's going to help me monitor that chat. I want your suggestions then about how we could make our fieldwork more sustainable.
Being most sustainable.
Say again?
10 being most sustainable.
Yeah. We've got Naomi saying, oh, I can see, oh, Naomi Holmes saying 4. Was it Roy 5? Linda 5? Okay. Have we got anyone claiming a 10 at this point? I can't see the chat. I can just see one other thing. Any other? Oh, 8. Okay, we're building our confidence here. I think the numbers are going high. Okay, mostly close to 10, but I couldn't see what that before it flicked over. For local work, thank you. Yeah. So it'd be really nice to know those that are coming in the first class category, 70 and above. So 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s. Yeah, what is it making? What is it that makes your fieldwork sustainable? So we've had someone saying it's about being local. Multiple field trips, some 10, some less than 10. So this idea of optionality being really important. Yeah. Gardens. Fantastic. Sarah, is there anything from the chat? I'm only seeing the first 2 words of it.
Sure. There is a question about do you think it would be possible to alter the arms race based on who provides the most sustainable offering rather than exotic destinations? Maybe that's
brilliant. That's a great question and something that I've thought about, and I'm sure the Royal Geographical Society would love to own a league table of the most sustainable fieldwork if people get to a state where they've done their carbon accounting and are prepared to share that. I think, you know, the work from Durham's brilliant because it just provides something that you can compare against. It's great. So I think, yeah, I could see that potentially, but my answer is tempered by the response of the Durham students who are still looking for some of those more exotic trips. So I think we've still got to do, yeah, a job of work on that. Okay.
There's some interesting comments here about during COVID, we couldn't get overseas for fieldwork, so local partners collected data.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what I was talking about. If you have those reciprocal relationships already, you have local partners. It's not a parachute style of fieldwork. Okay, in the chat, could you now please add how you could make your fieldwork more sustainable? I think there'll be real value in then collating that chat together so we can presumably share that afterwards. Yeah, so please, ideas in the chat for how you could make your fieldwork more sustainable in the future. And then
yeah, there's a comment here again, Helen, about whether this is the big trip versus lots of little local trips. You know, again, a different sort of balance.
Yeah, and so I think the idea of the principles is that it's a global, it's a program level response. So we need to think about trying to reduce our carbon on a global level. And so small field trips make that up. It might be that you have one flagship field trip, but there's lots of other local work that prepares students. So when they go on that field trip, they can get the most from it because they've already developed the skills locally, that kind of thing. So I do think we need to look at it in the round. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to, I'm hoping there's lots of ideas coming in the chat that we can summarise. But if I just end by talking to my pedagogy for sustainability, thinking about equity, futurity and environment. For me, obviously, fieldwork's for all students and the appropriate choice of environment is absolutely crucial. But student-led field research that can make a positive impact is, to me, what fieldwork should be like at university level. And that we can gradually give students more control in the fieldwork that they do over time, and especially thinking about fieldwork skills as we're developing them, to frame them as capabilities And I choose that word really carefully. I've written on geo capabilities, but capabilities are things that you can do today and into the future throughout your whole life. A competency is something you can do today, tick it, and you might have forgotten it by the end of the week or after the next exam. So the capabilities around doing research in the field, I think, is really important. And then fieldwork results being disseminated publicly is really important too. If we're taking this idea of us having some kind of privileged access to field data, we should share that. We should give that back to the communities, our partners that we work with, and the wider public, obviously doing that appropriately. But I really feel that that's important. And so our pedagogy should take that dissemination of findings from fieldwork into the planning of the work that we do. And then I would say this, wouldn't I? Because my research is about effective mentoring of students doing research, whether that's in the field or not. But I think that pedagogic research on effective mentoring in field work can enhance the student experience and benefit academic staff's well-being too. So I've recently been writing about how doing research as a student is good for your well-being. So check that out in the references. But I really believe that to be the case. It's around motivation, and I think we can link that into all field work, teaching and learning, not just when students have kind of got to the stage where they're in charge of the research. So I think I'll, if you want to know what effective fieldwork mentoring looks like, then there's a list for you. It's planned, personalised, clear expectations. Students gain increasing ownership, and they learn the disciplinary methods and norms through doing fieldwork. They gain academic and emotional support from staff. There's one-to-one time, as well as feeling a sense of research community, and there's support for research dissemination. Okay, I practice what I preach. I've created a thing at Oxford Brookes called the Get Published. It's a Get Published research collection, and it's a big project to help students disseminate their research. It's moved beyond just geography now, and it's for the whole university across different disciplines. So I'm not just making this up. This is something that I've put into practice. And there's some references which you can download if you get the presentation later. So how much time have we got for questions, if any, Derek?
7 minutes.
We have 7 minutes for questions there. I fulfilled my brief. That's good. Okay.
Okay, so just feeding back a couple of things that have come up in the chat. Feeding back from the chat about people's ideas about sustainability in their own field. Just summarising, because there are lots of comments. Hopefully we can gather these together later and site for sharing. One was about making local partnerships, which come up quite a lot of times with different organisations around the country to work with field work. And the other one that I spotted was students having a voice. So somebody said that their students have voted not to fly.
Oh, interesting. So maybe the Durham example has an opposing student view. It'd be very interesting to find out where that is and what the reasons are. And maybe that's something that's shifting. Maybe student attitudes will change over time. And as different universities declare climate emergencies and things like that. So on the local partnerships, do you mean that one university is the partner of another university and one university's local is somebody else's exotic field trip? Or did you mean it's about local non-academic partners?
Just reading the comments, I think it's a mixture. So there's more enhanced learning with local partners, where student data provides authentic output for local stakeholders. But there's also comments about teaming up with other universities.
There was a lovely initiative during COVID that Leeds University asked for partners to send their students, but also would receive students from other universities to provide this UK-based field work, and they laid out really carefully what they would be doing in their field trips around in the Leeds area, and brokered these sorts of relationships. So there was, yeah, really nice sharing of experiences, as well as people working in partnership locally. And I think that's the broader view of sustainability, rather than just thinking about carbon, is thinking about developing local partnerships. Sorry, I'm not sure why there's a bit of feedback there. Were there any questions? I realise there's people in the room. Addy, hi.
Could you just introduce themselves when you talk on the mic so that people hear that you don't hear speaking?
So Andy Pop from Esri. I wondered, with the move to sort of sustainability and thinking about reduction in costs and reduction in travel, do you think it will do anything to promote diversity and inclusion in the subject, where people don't necessarily feel that they belong to the field, or the financial burden of taking geography and being expected to pay, what was it, £1,000 for the mandatory field trip from Durham? Do you think it might promote more inclusion?
Yeah, I think it's got great potential to promote more inclusion. Thank you very much for the question. I think, you know, there's a bit of a backlash against the marketing of some of our field work, where you see somebody on the top of a mountain and, you know, maybe it's a white male on the top of the mountain in full walking gear with lots of kit, you know, that kind of the slight macho image of fieldwork. I think there's a sort of democratization of opportunities to do fieldwork if it's no longer conceptualized as that kind of sweaty, muddy experience, but actually it can be done in your backyard. It can be done locally. It can benefit working with local partners. And I think on the other side, the fieldwork costs idea, and this idea of having the financial burden of a field trip, I think there's two different views amongst students. Some really want to save up to have that experience because it's not something that they've ever had before, and may not again, let's say, travel to New Zealand, and that's really what they want and what they're looking forward, and they've worked over the summer to earn that money, and that's how they would like to spend it. But yeah, I think there's potential to, with the low carbon field trip option idea, to make sure that there's a baseline that everyone can access field work, regardless of that. But I don't think it's just about cost. I think we have to factor in, it's things like time. Do people have, you know, if you've got caring commitments, it's not necessarily just about the cost. It's the ability to be away. And we need to think about all of those issues in the round. Yeah, but I think the way that we market fieldwork needs to follow this. And I think it can also educate our marketing of fieldwork in a more democratic way and a more sustainable way, can really educate people to make choices. So, yeah. Thank you.
Was there any reason? If nothing changes, then you have no opportunity to analyse what you're doing and why you're doing it. And possibly COVID gave us that opportunity where we had to change and respond, and then reflect on, is what we have been doing the best way to do it going forward? And COVID coincided with COP26 and heightening of that environmental cost. And I think it is always good to reflect, and that's maybe what the gift that COVID gave us, if you can actually call it.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think that reflection provoked the writing of these principles. It provoked a conversation about the arms race of exotic field trips, as I've called it. And I think we have to, this is the moment
so many people on one router, it may drop in and out of the journey.
It's probably a good time to close the session. So,
Okay.
thank Helen for the keynote and
Thank
the
you.
first session.
Thank you.
Yours online for